Everybody. I'm Erica Kobut. I am on the board of the Theosophical Society. I'll just let you know that. It is my absolute pleasure. I'm so excited. Joe has been a friend. Look at him. He's like, I'm so excited that Joe is presenting to us. I met him in 2004 in Florida. We were in massage school together at a massage and acupuncture college, and it was like an instant friendship. It was just so much fun. Before I babble on and on about Joe. And I'm so excited about this topic tonight too. He has done so much in his life exploring, we'll call it spirituality, many things, and takes it and it becomes a part of him. And I think this is going to be fun tonight, where he gets to share some of this interesting topic that I have absolutely no idea what this is about. I went and looked a little bit at the Red Book and went, okay, I am ready to hear. So without further ado, my friend Joe Caballero, enjoy the presentation this evening.
Thank you, Erica, and got me teary-eyed. You did. All right, so I don't know if I haven't shared the screen yet, so you're just going to have to give me a second there while I get prepared, because I'm just going to jump into it because there's a lot to go over, and it's going to sound maybe overwhelming. I put a lot of visuals in here so that way you're kind of like with your senses getting this into you, as opposed to trying to sit here and make sense of something that is just like all over the place. And I try to put it together as best that I can. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to just start, and hopefully I'll share the right one. And I'm cheating over here to see. And there we go. All right, so we are good to go. So this is the Red Book, Carl Gustav Jung's The Red Book. I originally started this presentation in your typical manner, just researching the history and the background of the Red Book, when I defaulted to the way I've always approached a creative endeavor. I set up the intention, I gather as much information as I can, and then I let it ferment. I leave it to what I think is the ethers to come back to working on it when I'm ready or inspired. But what always happens instead is that if the topic is important enough to me, it will resurface with a fresh approach or outlook, or provide a piece of information I knew but hadn't thought about that applies, or a supposition arises that leads to information I was not aware of. In this way, the intention becomes co-contributor. And in a lot of what I was putting together tonight, I was going in one direction and then just had to cut it because it was important but didn't flow, or there wasn't enough time and there was more important things to present. But yeah, like I said, the intention is what is the co-contributor. And there's something other than the rational me that put this presentation together. And we can jump to the assumption that it's the subconscious that brought those things forth, but the odd thing is that there are personalities attached to these co-contributors, and they don't always have the same demeanor or voice. And the more I interact with them, the more I recognize them as separate entities, for lack of a better word. And if this kind of talk is normal in the Red Book, then it's the book for you. There is an atmosphere of the enigmatic in this particular work of Jung's, and though the subject matter stems from the psychoanalytical, the approach taken here will side more with the esoteric. So if you're looking for a purely scientific talk, this may not be for you. I want to make clear that I will not be trying to sound cryptic or mysterious in the presentation, and will fail miserably at it. Unfortunately, what Jung was trying to relay in the Red Book is of a mercurial nature, and what he wrote in it at times either sounds like a religious tirade or is so cryptic sounding that it's hard to make sense. And I'll be summarizing the best I can, I promise. I also want to point out that most of the presentation is summary. Almost all of it is summary. None of the ideas I'll be presenting are my own unless I specifically state they are. Everything being presented here is either Jung's observations, realizations, theories, interpretations, or interpretations of others that are referenced. And one other disclaimer. If you're very conservative in your beliefs, and I know a lot of us here aren't, but if there are things that you're just a little touchy about, which is, everyone has their pet peeves, you may also want to skip this presentation because you can't really talk about Jung without archetypes, and archetypes exist heavily in all religions. And we're not going to necessarily see them in a nice light. Much of this subject matter will also not be for the squeamish, since delving into the shadow goes hand in hand with dealing with the uncomfortable. And for the scientific Stoics, you may also want to tap out because not much I'll be talking about can be scientifically proven, since science can only know what the brain limits. And we'll be talking about how we need to get away from the brain in a way. So, whoops, sorry, and I just went too far. And that's technology for you. Yes, because there's one thing that, one last disclaimer. Very, very, very important. I must warn that anyone with any mental health issues not try to pursue what Jung did in this book without medical supervision. Jung was a psychiatrist, but he was, for the time, a medical doctor, and this was not an experiment he chose to do. He was analyzing what he was already experiencing, not originally inducing it. He did induce it later on, but not originally. Psychoanalysis explored using some of these techniques under medical supervision is usually considered safe. However, unsupervised, such experiences could aggravate a pre-existing condition or trauma and result in an unexpected or undesirable outcome. And to show that I'm not sensationalizing, I'll give you the example of grieving. Some people can remain rational about the whole thing. Some stay emotionally distant for whatever reason. Some are distant but then have a breakdown as a result of repression. Some fall into a depression. Some lash out. And for some, the grief is so overwhelming and without seeming end that they come close to shutting down. So how would you handle the loss, the grieving of your self, or rather what you identify as yourself? Throughout the presentation, I'll try to emphasize that the word self to Jung is capital S self, not just another word for me in our mental narrative, but a disconnect with the self. It's similar to when you look in the mirror someday and you go face blind for a moment and you go, who is that person? I'm me. What I perceive is me, but who is that? And what Jung did was that self spoke, and it spoke back, and he listened. And if you did that in the mirror, that would be pretty creepy and would probably unhinge you a little bit. So that's why this is something that's very interesting, very exciting. But again, you should, if you're going to try it out for yourself, go into it with some precaution. So with that said, let's get to it. So that is a quote that, with synchronicity, I came across, and I say that quote is the moral of the Red Book. We live in an age of surfaces, and that is our problem. And Jung went beneath the surface. So, brief history of Carl Gustav Jung's The Red Book. I'll skip the backstory of who Jung was because if you're here, you probably already have an idea. In 1913, at the age of 38, Carl Gustav Jung, a highly esteemed psychoanalyst at the top of his game, suddenly and abruptly begins to experience visions and to hear voices, sometimes feeling as if he was being bombarded with them. And the assumption is that these visions were triggered by the cumulative stresses of his resigning from his position as assistant physician, which was very high, assistant physician to the professor at Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich back in 1909. and starting his own private practice, publishing The Psychology of the Unconscious, which led to his resigning as editor of the magazine, Yearbook for Psychoanalytical and Psychopathological Research, and declaring himself scientifically independent of Sigmund Freud in October of 1913. This resulted in the defamation of his character in the psychoanalytical community, and that culminated in Jung's resigning as president of the International Psychoanalytical Association that same year. And on what seemed a global level, the First World War, which consisted of years of diplomatic clashing between the great powers, and then the Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1913, and then the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in June 1914. Also, Jung's fifth child, Helene, was born just 3 months prior to Ferdinand's assassination, and Jung was also on active duty in the Swiss army between 1914 and 1918. So that's enough pressure to make a person snap. But being a psychoanalyst, Jung was afraid he was becoming psychotic or schizophrenic because his visions were popping up during everyday situations, and they were pretty terrifying. While Jung kept notes of his experiences from 1913 up to 1932 in 7 private journals known as the Black Books, and this is what I was talking about, that the Red Book is actually edited. These are the Black Books because they're black or brown covers. The exercises that fueled what would be known as the Red Book occurred sometime between 1913 and 1915, between his ages of 38 and 40. But he spent half a dozen years in whatever free time he could, while still seeing patients and interacting with his family, trying to suspend his conscious mind, sitting in the second floor office of his home so these hallucinations could play themselves out and deliver whatever messages they were trying to get through. In 1915, Jung commissioned the binding of a hefty 11.57 inch by 15.35 inch red leather book with 600 blank pages to work on. Though known today as the Red Book, the name on the spine of the book, embossed in gold, is Liber Novus, Latin for the New Book. In 1917, Jung supplemented the manuscripts he was transcribing from with a segment called Scrutinies, and continuously worked on the calligraphic transcription until 1930. Now, what I mean by that is that the notes were artfully transferred to the Red Book. The Liber Novus contains 205 pages, with 53 of those pages being full-page paintings, and the remainder a combination of images and illuminated calligraphy throughout. In formatting it into the Reader's Edition by Sonu Samdashani, which is mostly just the text, this translates to about 350 pages. The handwritten text in the original Liber Novus, which is mostly German and some Latin, is written in calligraphic pen with images in multicolored ink and gouache. The Libra Primus, the first book of the Red Book, contains 7 folios on parchment paper, which the leaves fold to make 14 pages. The Liber Primus appears to have been written on different paper from the rest of the book because Jung might have discovered that the parchment was not suitable for the inks and the paints he was trying to use. The Red Book was often in Jung's office for patients to look at, but he was concerned about publishing it because he feared facing ridicule from his scientific peers. So Jung eventually kept the book locked in a cupboard of his house in Zurich until his death in 1961. There were no instructions on what his children were to do with the book after his death, so his only son, Franz, kept it at the house after he took it over until 1984, when the book was locked up in a bank vault in Switzerland. Jung's family was protective of the book and denied access to it until historian Sonu Shamdasani presented text from the book that had been leaked out to the public, possibly while Jung shared the manuscript with some of his colleagues. He also informed them of one manuscript at a Yale library that belonged to a German publisher, and a transcript in the possession of Marie-Louise von Franz in Switzerland, a friend and longtime collaborator of Jung. And we'll talk a little bit about her later, and she's just absolutely wonderful. Anyway, after Franz Jung died in 1996, Professor Shamdasani convinced the family in 1997 to officially have the Red Book published by those who wished to handle it respectfully and tastefully, rather than have an unauthorized version released. In 2008, the Red Book was scanned by a 10,200 pixel scanner suspended on a dolly, scanning 1/10 of a millimeter at a time. The book was first published by W. W. Norton and Company on October 7, 2009, and coincided with the book going on exhibition for its first public showing at the Rubin Museum in New York City. And the reader's edition, the one without the illustrations, was released in 2012. The original Red Book, the original one, is still in a bank vault in Zurich. Now, while writing the Red Book, Jung was discovering that the psyche could not be easily compartmentalized, nor was that approach as efficient in helping the psyche heal. He conceived that there were archetypes, which are patterns, which could have multiple manifestations, while also conceiving of the collective unconscious, which is exactly what it sounds like, an unconscious collective that is like an ocean too vast to circumscribe, an ocean full of information that we somehow innately share. The Red Book, however, does not go into much detail in addressing the reasons for the visions, nor are they broken down psychoanalytically. They're simply documented along with how Jung reacted to them and how he felt. The technique he used is called active imagination, since it was not a case of letting the mind just wander on a long tether. The conscious still participates in the experiences, like daydreams or conscious imagination, but as little as possible. Because of the fantastical and often terrifying imagery Jung witnessed during active imagination, he felt it surely played some part in similar accounts given by the insane. Though the Red Book is lauded by many as a great work, I think it's a matter of some people jumping on the bandwagon. It's a hard read, sometimes both in style and content, and even harder to understand what Jung is getting at. The text and artwork is beautiful, and the amount of time and effort that obviously went into it rivals illuminated texts of religious devotees. But the Red Book doesn't reveal anything to the psychoanalytical field in the sense of scientific methodology. That came later, as Jung mulled it over in his reworkings. Archetypes, collective unconscious, individuation, these concepts rose out of the Red Book, but are not mentioned in its actual text. And the Red Book is kind of like Zen Buddhism or quantum physics, where the more we seem to know, the more we seem to not know, or contaminated with knowledge we so tightly cling to. So, a synopsis of the visions in the Red Book. These are the induced visions of Jung's descent into hell, into his shadow unconscious, where repressed ideas and feelings dwell. I will be presenting the artwork, sorry, I skipped, in the Red Book briefly after going over the visions, because I feel that the artwork, they're meditations of their own and should be enjoyed at one's own pace. I am going to show them quickly, but if you were reading the Red Book, someone wouldn't be talking over your shoulder as you immersed yourself in the artwork. And you should immerse yourself because, again, they're beautiful. So I'll be using other illustrations in the discussion of the visions, and also illustrations that would make more sense as to symbols that are repeated. This doesn't take away from them, since many of the visions were influenced by other works anyway, and that can seem a little plagiaristic on Jung's part. But later I'll be going over how familiar myths help us deal with the unconscious, and it'll make sense why Jung keeps turning back to them to deal with the indescribable. So, the Libra Primus. Jung starts the Red Book speaking of the spirit of the depths, the unconscious, and the spirit of the times, the conscious. After a while, you can determine that the depths is synonymous with what is deeply concealed within, and that the spirit of the times is synonymous with the conscious. which must be accounted for in waking reality. So Jung keeps pointing out that we ignore the depths which influence our lives just as much as what surrounds us physically by living too exclusively in the conscious. So Jung's first vision occurred sometime in October of 1913. It was in broad daylight, and Jung claimed it lasted almost 2 hours. During the vision, he sees a flood of debris, somewhat like what you see here, and dead bodies spanning from England across to Russia and as far south as the Alps. 2 weeks later, he has the vision again, only more intensified, and a voice now commands him to behold it, that what he is seeing will happen. This is when Jung begins to think that he may be losing his mind. And then he has a third vision, and this time the sea is full of blood. This is the rare time in the Red Book that Jung does make rational analysis of the visions, as he realizes that they've erupted at a point in his life when he had achieved everything, and that he was now at an age when he was beginning to deal with his mortality. Jung's slowing down his historically ambitious pursuits must have been a shock to his system, terrifying to him, since his self identified so strongly with his achievements. Jung had a little bit of an ego, just like Freud had a bit of his ego. So later on, Jung will feel that the events that occurred in Europe were synchronistic with the inflation of his ego. And we'll be talking about what that means later also. And he interpreted that, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was paralleling the archetypes in his vision. He has a vision of a hero being sacrificed, and it just so happens that here is Franz Ferdinand, a hero, being sacrificed. So on November 12, 1913, Jung feels the spirit of the depths. Now remember, that's the unconscious. He feels that it's calling out to his soul. And 2 nights later, he calls to his soul, and he sees it emerge from a dark shaft in dreams, seen as a child or a maiden, and he questions whether it's God. The next night, Jung understands that he must trust and love his soul, and after 6 nights of complete silence, Jung is told to look deeper and awaken the dead. 6 nights after that, his soul leads him into the deserted wasteland of his self, and Jung realizes how empty his self is, and that superficial things are unfulfilling. On December 11, 1913, Jung continues supplicating to his soul for understanding. Jung says it takes him now almost a month of nights in this desert to make sense of what the spirit of the depths was trying to convey to him. On December 12th, 1913, Jung initiates his imagination actively for the first time. And that's that term that we've been throwing around, active imagination. Finding himself in a cave, he crawls down through a crack in the rocks into another cave full of black water and the sounds of screaming. He sees a red stone in the distance and tries to reach it. He understands the stone is wisdom, and it covers an opening which his curiosity leads him to listen into. He discovers a dark stream, and on its waters he sees the blood-covered head of a man, the hero, a wounded body floating with it, and a black scarab floating beside. Far down the stream shines a red sun, the walls of the cave covered in serpents that also covered the sun and turned the stream into blood. Later in 1914, Jung will be convinced that these visions were precognitive, and he retitles this chapter, Descent into Hell in the Future. On December 16, now this is 1913, Jung finds himself in the desert and says invisible beings live there who change his form beyond recognition. The spirit of the depths, the unconscious, instruct him to go deeper, and that this path is of an otherworldly light, that everything he knows comes from it and serves it. Jung is indignant at its riddles and devious nature, but concedes that there is a civil war going on within himself. He believes that his first vision foretold the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, he claims that looking into one's depths can give insight into what is to come because it's partly responsible. He understands that once the highest depths are achieved, like a god, the depths dismantle the deity, which is what he believes has happened to Franz Ferdinand. He's kind of reached up to the sun a little too high and was knocked down. On December 18th, Jung finds himself on a mountain. Once again, this is with active imagination. These are the visions. He finds himself on a mountain with a young boy awaiting their foe, and their foe is Siegfried, and the hero. And Siegfried's horn sounds as he shows up on a chariot made of bones. Jung and this youth shoot and kill Siegfried, who Jung cited in other works as a symbol of the libido. Though he found the character of Siegfried overblown, he recognized him as an unappreciated hero in the vision and feels kind of sorry for him, even though he killed him. There's then a sudden downpour of rain, which Jung says is symbolic of a release of unconscious tension. And in the version a few nights before the killing of the superior hero, Franz Ferdinand, it is felt that it is necessary for all that is inferior to evolve. So the spirit of the depths reveals to Jung that the greatest truths are the ones with the absurd, that meanings are moments, always transitioning into the absurd. In a second vision, same date, forms walk in white silk in a garden lit in reds and blues and greens. Jung understands that gods and their values are meant to be overcome, renewed, but for fear of killing a deity, we instead kill our princes. Jung says Christ had to become his Antichrist by descending into hell, becoming hell, in order to ascend to heaven. And like I said at the beginning of the presentation, this is the kind of talk that we're going to be hearing. It's kind of convoluted. It's kind of dichotomous, and feels a little blasphemous, but there are some points in there. So anyway, Christ must become Antichrist, descend into hell in order to ascend into to heaven, and in this way take the form of the archetypal Antichrist, which will usher in the new archetypal God. Jung writes that as a deity grows old, it's relegated to the shadow and becomes nonsense in its descent. And we'll talk about the shadow and how things get dumped in there later on. Now, there are 28 more entries just like this, which can be tedious, and these were the short ones. So I'll be briefly summarizing the rest and spend more time on the more noteworthy entries. But just to let you know that in the Red Book, each chapter is lengthy because of just how meaty the information is. So on December 20, the unconscious psyche comes to Jung while active imagining with its dichotomous nature. And he understands that the God we seek in the absolute exists in all things, good or evil, because God's nature, being absolute, is also dichotomous. Years later, Jung summarized that the descent into hell is the sinking of old values into the unconscious, and that includes images of the deceased. And that's mentioned because there will be talk about the deceased later on. These values reintegrate with the darkness and create a new order, the ascent into heaven, a resurrection. Now, the spirit of the depths points out the beauty and joy that emerges from the depths released by war, which sounds kind of morbid, but again, there's a point. Without a descent into the depths, there can be no ascent to great heights. To descend into hell is to become it, but one should not enter hell thinking oneself a hero, because the image of the hero is not whole, and we need to become whole. Jung tells us that hell is what the depths show you is out of reach, what is no longer of purpose to you, or what is beyond you, such as a paradise lost. but you must still act because all the decisions having to do with your hell rest on you. That every judgment you make in life is also the inverse. Serious is laughable, good is bad, so on. Because God's nature is equivocal. Even God comes forth from the unknown, from the darkness, to radiate his light. On December 21st, during active imagination, Jung meets the prophet Elijah. A black snake is at his feet. Jung looks into a clear stone and sees the journeys of Odysseus, because to become one's true self, one must explore. There is no hero without a challenge. Elijah introduces himself and his blind daughter, Salome. Blind because she is the anima. We're going to talk about that also later, which is a very well-known Jungian term. She is the anima, connecting the conscious and unconscious without seeing the unconscious. As a symbol for passion, Jung fears Salome because she wants his head, just like in the biblical story. His thinking is that maybe this is because he's been ignoring his feelings, that he's been living in his head. So Salome declares her love for Jung, but Jung rejects her temptations. And I'm going to clarify something real quick here, which I didn't include. The anima is seen as the female aspect of the male, and the female has a male aspect called the animus. And basically, those are the opposites that are within us, the secret parts, the guilty pleasures that we don't act on consciously. And that's just a brief kind of explanation of that. But just to give you an idea of Salome is kind of his opposite self. On December 22nd, Jung is in the depths of a crater and is at the same house as the night before. He sees Salome walking, the snake following her, and Elijah beckons to him again. In the house, Jung sees Mary with the baby Jesus, Peter, the Pope, a Buddha sitting in a ring of flames, and then Kali, who becomes Salome, wringing her hands. Jung realizes Salome is his soul. Elijah makes Jung confess that his thoughts are not outside of himself, but a part of him, the I. Since all is thought, then everything processed with thought is him, what we perceive as I. Salome enters, puts her arm around Jung, and declares Elijah is their father and Mary their mother. Jung blames the insinuation of incest now as the reason for his being repulsed by her attraction. And Jung argues that they must be symbols, but Elijah insists that both he and Salome are as real as people. On December 25th, another act of imagination, Jung finds himself at a ridge separating night and day. Elijah once again is there. He stands atop the ridge, and in the darkness is a black snake. In the bright side of the ridge is a white snake. The snakes fight one another, the black one taking the upper hand, but when the dust settles, the front of the black snake has turned white as both recoil and curl up into themselves. Elijah takes Jung up to the Temple of the Sun, shrinks down to a dwarf, and reveals himself to be Mime, who convinced Siegfried. Remember, Siegfried is that hero that he killed that was riding on that chariot. Mime had convinced Siegfried to kill Fafnir, the dragon, in the myth. And this dragon guarded a powerful ring. Now, all of these are symbols, archetypes later on that Jung will find are repeated throughout our myths and histories and some religions. So here is the great hero has been tricked into taking on a task that can be deadly, and the task is to kill a dragon for its treasure. That's very common in fairy tales. Now, Mime had intended to kill Siegfried once he killed Fafnir the dragon. That was that story. So Jung follows who is now mime, into the cave. Uh, and Elijah explains that Jung's difficulty in reaching the underworld comes from his desiring it too much. He's just too eager. And there Jung sees the baby Jesus with that white snake in his right hand and the black in his left. On a green mountain is Christ's cross, blood streaming from its crest. The black snake coils at the base of the cross where Jesus hangs, and Jung now sees the black snake wound around his own feet, his arms stretched out. Salome nears Jung, and the snake continues to wrap around Jung, strangling him, his face turning into a lion's. Salome tells Jung he is Christ and Mary is his mother. Jung's body bleeds down the mountain as Salome wraps her black hair around his feet, and she can suddenly see. And Elijah shines bright as the snake falls into Jung's body, and he kneels by Elijah. Elijah tells him his work is finished and to write all that he has seen. That was the Libra Primus. So this now is the Liber Secundus. This is the second book of the Red Book. On December 26th, during active imagination, Jung stands guard at the top of a castle. He's been sent back in time by a spell. And he sees a red horseman approaching until the horseman stands before him, the red one, red in every aspect. Jung fears him and fears him to be the devil. And the red one says it was Jung's waiting that called him. And Jung confesses that he's been waiting at the top of the tower for the world's riches as he sizes up the red knight. The red one burns red like iron and says Jung's critical mind amuses him, and he calls him pious and dour like a Christian saint. And Jung claims life requires solemnity, but the red one disagrees, that life should be danced, to which Jung scoffs. The red one removes his mask, turns the color of red flesh, and Jung's garments burst into leaves. He becomes the Green Man. Jung confesses he has been waiting for a joy that merits dancing before God, and the red one reveals that he is that joy, and then disappears. Jung realizes that the red one was his devil, and devil here does not necessarily represent our concept of the devil. We'll talk more about that later. So he is the devil, the joy of the ease of living that escapes the serious. Now on December 28th, Jung gets lost in a dark forest until he comes to a swamp of dark waters, and a small castle is now at its center. He knocks on the door, it begins to rain, and an old man eventually lets him in. He takes him up the staircase to a study where a scholar in black robes sits, but is too engrossed in his studies to pay attention to Jung. The servant takes Jung to a small bedroom, and while Jung thinks over how a scholar's solitary life is ideal, he gets the idea that the scholar has hidden his daughter in Jung's bedroom. Jung finds this whole scenario to be just super cliche from some kind of sappy novel. Though he acknowledges that he doesn't have the energy to confront anything more profound anyway, but it still kind of ticks him off. And now a pale girl appears at the door, kind of like what he was thinking, and he's appalled at her ghostly demeanor, how like pale and white she is, and she's offended at his thoughts of her, his doubting of her being real. And so she cries at the foot of his bed. She explains that her father holds her captive in the castle out of love because she's his only child and resembles her mother who died young. Jung again thinks this is pure fiction from a cheap novel, but decides to believe her. And his consideration transforms her into a vibrant beauty, one he can't believe is in the underworld. She asks if he loves her, and he confesses that he does, but says he's married. She thanks him, sends him greetings from Salome, and disappears, leaving a multitude of roses behind. In the next act of imagination on December 29, Jung is wandering a countryside covered in snow, and an overcast sky covers the sun. A dirty, one-eyed, out-of-work tramp, about Jung's age, walks with him. Jung doesn't trust him. Jung suggests the tramp go work for a farmer if he needs money. But the tramp replies that farmers don't stimulate him mentally, as the city does, which surprises Jung. The tramp explains he lost his eye in a fight over a woman he wanted to marry and spent 6 months in a beautiful prison. Jung ponders the freedom of hitting rock bottom, since there is nowhere else to go at that point but up. Now remember, back in the real world, Jung is dealing with all of his achievements that he's kind of let go. So he kind of envies this guy's rock bottom. After the fight, the woman didn't want anything to do with this tramp. She didn't want to marry him anymore. And though he has a problem with his lungs, he claims he'll get better and he'll eventually track her down when he's in a good situation and try to marry her when he goes into a coughing fit. Jung goes to sleep that night, but is abruptly awakened by the tramp's coughing in another room, and he finds him bleeding from the mouth, laying in a dark puddle of blood, and the tramp dies. Jung is surprised death occurs in hell for those who are not flesh and blood, and wrestles with the unjustness of death. On December 30th, Jung is in a desert under a harsh sun, again, during active imagination. He follows a set of footprints in the sand that go in circles until they lead him to a mud hut with a red cross painted on its wood door. A brown-skinned old man in a white cloak, an anchorite, one who withdraws from society to pray, sits on a mat, and a book with ornate writing is on his lap. The tracks belong to the old man who takes daily walks. He's been there for 10 years. The anchorite thinks that Jung is a pagan, and because he keeps asking all of these questions about the book that he's reading, which is the gospel. The old man says he's preoccupied with grieving and with reading. He explains that one can read the same book many times, but can always find new interpretations, or one's experience can alter our understanding of the book, but Jung can't seem to agree. Now, that's a very important point right there. It's not just a story. Remember, this is the unconscious speaking to Jung, and it's telling him that you can look at the same things over and over, and you can think that it's the same patterns, but those patterns can affect you differently every single time. So it's not odd to see these patterns repeat themselves, because they're really not repeating. So the anchorite says that mankind wants a series of words to have only one meaning, but only the omniscient one can know all the meanings. The old man tells Jung he's a teacher of rhetoric in Alexandria and trapped his listeners as well as himself in the creativity of his words, to the point of instilling divinity into them and believing them real. He warns, however, that words should not be gods and one should not be their slave. He has many years of unlearning left before him. The anchorite leaves, and Jung falls asleep in a grave after the anchorite tells him to pray at sunrise. So the next day, January 1st, during active imagination, Jung admits not being able to find words for his morning prayer, but the anchorite assures him the soul found the unexpressed words. His name, the anchorite, is Ammonius, and he explains that he freed himself from words when someone told him God became flesh through his son. The anchorite explains to Jung that each religion holds most of what the previous religion teaches, so he spends his time searching the Gospels for the hidden future meaning of what will come from them. The anchorite feels Jung has threatened his solitude in the desert and is now angry, taking him to be Satan. Next act of imagination on January 2nd, Jung follows a living stream down to the sea and descends into the depths. A pale, stern man in a black wrinkled coat stands on a dune. Jung asks to stand next to him, and the man says he can if he can stand the cold, since his heart has never beaten. Jung recognizes him as the cold end and says he must experience this. A stolid wall of people and animals and vegetation, arm in arm, move in the ocean towards them all and flow past them. Where the sea and the stream meet, the air lifts them all up and dissolves them into a torrent of black mist. Bloody foam breaks at Jung's feet, and the dark sea glows red as a new sun emerges from the sea. On the next act of imagination on January 5th, Jung is in a meadow and comes across a portly old monk, which he recognizes as Ammonius the Anchorite, and a tall, thin, childish man in faded red clothes, which Jung recognizes as the Red One, though he's now old and his hair gray. They're frightened of Jung because he's covered in green leaves and they think him an evil spirit. They're annoyed at Jung for causing their current states. Jung's curiosity made the anchorite aware of his ignorance of the divine and made him crave the company of others, succumbing to the temptations of the world until he encountered the Red One. And the Red One says, after he spoke with Jung of dancing a life, he reconsidered, became serious, converted, and went to a monastery, but introduced dance in his worship until all the church congregation danced, and dancing became common. He isolated himself and danced in the forests until exhaustion, but the next day would tortuously dance again until he found the ragged monk. Ammonius the Anchorite and the Red One both appreciate how the other is not an extreme devil or fanatic, but they confess they are in each other's company out of necessity and can never really be friends. Jung loses his patience with both of them and leaves them since they are obviously relics of the past. Jung now feels he's become the solitary trickster of the forest, who is himself a tree. Remember, he sprouted into leaves when he came across the Red One, originally in the castle. And as that tree, he only loves growth. He was indifferent to mankind, and like nature, is ambiguous in all ways. He's absorbed the life of the monk and the Red Rider because they had been seduced by life and then blamed life by judging it as the devil. Their ridiculous outcome was typical of the ideal, and all was of their own doing. Now, the active imagination on January 8th, Jung is at a mountain range, and it blocks his way, so he has to pass through a narrow gorge. He cuts his feet trying to get through, and half the path is white, freezing ice, and the other is black hot iron. A booming sound comes from the other side of the mountain. A black bearded giant with bull horns and covered in armor comes nearer. He carries a double axe and suddenly stands before Jung. Jung recognizes him as Izdubar, the bull man, later known as Gilgamesh, the Mesopotamian myth. Izdubar asks where he comes from, and Jung explains he's from the west, where the sun sinks beyond the sea. Izdubar is perplexed and upset that there is no land where the sun is reborn on the west horizon. He's overcome with fear when Jung explains that science knows the sun is far out in space and that no mortal can reach the sun. Realizing now that no one can reach the sun and thus immortality, Izdubar breaks down in tears. He has never been defeated until now, and by words. Jung regrets speaking truth, and seeing that night approaches, begs Izdubar to let him get help, but he refuses, telling him to just speak more. Jung explains that the truth of our priests is different, and Izdubar cannot comprehend how there can be two truths. Jung explains that our truths come from the knowledge of outer things, and that their truth comes from inner things. Izdubar is surprised that so much knowledge does not poison man, and Jung explains it is because they have grown accustomed to it with time, that mankind has to integrate into it or else die, as our gods do. We have no gods left, only words. Izdubar warns that the light of the East might be too much for Jung if their world is so dark. A continued active imagination on January 9th, Jung cannot find the words to revive Izdubar. He is dying. And he convinces Izdubar that he is not real, reminding him that one's essence lies in their name, and to change their name can heal. Izdubar agrees, as his priests also believe this. Jung tells Izdubar that he is becoming lighter, so light that he can carry him. Jung carries him to the west, shrinks Izdubar to the size of an egg in order to carry him through the door of a house in a peaceful garden by placing him in his pocket, and they enter the house. The next active imagination, January 10th, Jung cracks open the egg and Isdabar appears before him, back to health, and tells of how he was the sun in a dark sky while in the egg. Isdabar shines light so bright that Jung must look away. Jung declares him the eternal light, but realizes that the room, despite the golden rebirth, is no different. Jung sees himself as the mother to the egg of creation, though he wanted to be the sun. But instead, he renewed the sun. So he guesses that's okay. And that'll be important later on, too, about how he wanted to be the sun. Jung understands that he took Isdabar's force when he struck him down with that truth, but that Jung's force entered Isdabar when he was in the egg. As Isdabar rises a sun, Jung descends further into the underworld, powerless. In the next act of imagination on January 12th, Jung is in a vault in the underworld. Hanging on a column are ropes and axes, a pile of bodies at the base. Jung notices a maiden with gold red hair and a serpentine man laying beneath her, blood running down his forehead. Two more similarly evil-looking men lay over her body and feet. The maiden, which is Jung's soul, holds a fishing rod that she's forced into the eye of the man beneath her in self-defense, as they meant to torture her to death. Jung hears a voice explain that one can only be victorious through sacrifice, but Jung later understands that evil, being emptiness, has nothing to sacrifice. Jung believes he's succumbed to evil because he gave birth to God, because to strive for absolute wholeness creates a void of equal proportion, and only by avoiding the creation of a God can you escape evil. Evil values most of all its I, because it imbibes fullness through it. Its emptiness can only capture fullness by observing, because it is, after all, emptiness. Evil is necessary for fullness to sacrifice itself too. Jung understands that his soul should not have stabbed evil's eye, because its eyes are what deem beauty beautiful. But the act is mute, because evil has many eyes. The external form of God is destroyed by evil, but not the image of God Jung keeps within. Jung then finds himself in a valley of lethargic snakes and comes across a marionette with a broken head, and then behind a bush, the small body of a wounded girl covered in blood. Here comes the squeamish part. One of her legs is crushed, and her head is so badly beaten, its features are indistinguishable. Next to her stands a shrouded figure, her face covered. She asks Jung if he understands, and he answers that he is too enraged to understand. She doesn't know why knowing of an atrocity that occurs every day fails to enrage him, but witnessing it does. He admits that not witnessing it makes it less real. She points out that the body is already cut open and instructs him to take out its liver, for her sake, because she is the soul of the child and needs to be atoned for. After much protesting, Jung cuts the warm liver out and holds it up to the shrouded figure, who reminds him it represents the vigor of life. She thanks him and then tells him to eat a piece in lieu of the whole. Jung protests further, but the woman says he's created this unspeakable scenario so that the atonement for his committing murder coincides with his debasement. He represents mankind and is as guilty as if he's carried out the crime himself. Jung submits and suffers with the struggle of swallowing the piece of liver, a ritual Eucharist. The beautiful red-headed woman removes her veil and reveals herself to be Jung's soul. Jung understands the child was the image of God's form. The emergence of a God makes him ascend. Within God is also our evil desire for his light. Man must seek out his own evil to commit the act of murder, but must not deny responsibility for the evil it has committed. By consuming God's life force, man disassociates himself from God for the sake of the soul by destroying God's form, the very God his soul will then give birth to. This sacrifice redeems the ancestral capacity to birth God. Active imagination on January 14th. Jung stands in an anteroom, a green curtain parting between two columns before him, and he climbs a flight of stairs to a room and chooses the door on the right. He finds a thin librarian in a scholarly reading room. The librarian asks Jung what he wants and, unsure, requests for the book The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis, a 15th century book instructing on meditation and seeking spirituality with the intent of following Christ's example. The librarian is surprised in Jung's interest, and Jung continues to explain that, though scholarly, science sometimes leads to emptiness, and it is then that his soul needs religion. They continue to discuss the waning of religion and its viability. The book is brought to Jung, and he leaves. The next act of imagination, January 17 of 1914. Jung takes the door on the left now that leads to a kitchen with a chimney over a stove. A fat cook at the stove lets him sit at one of the two long tables, and he begins to read the book. She asks if he's a clergyman because he is reading a religious book similar to one her mother gave her on her deathbed. It turns out to be the same book. Jung comes across a line in the book stating that the righteous trust God's mercy more than their wisdom. And suddenly the hall is filled with a roaring noise and shadows sweeping past him, with voices overlapping saying that they must pray in the temple. When Jung asks where they're going, a bearded, disheveled man, Ezekiel the Anabaptist, turns and says that he and his fellows believers are off to Jerusalem to pray at the Holy Sepulchre and then to all the holy places. Jung asks them to take him with him, but the man says they are dead and he has a body, so he can't. The old man admits not knowing why they wander in such a manner without peace, though they died true believers. He says something seems to have remained unlived, and thinking Jung may know the answer, startles Jung by grabbing him suddenly. Jung implores him to let go, yelling the truth that they did not live their animal element. Now, this to me is my opinion, this to me is the most important part of the Red Book. Jung has now had these lessons presented to him kind of subtly by his soul and all these other figures. But when he sees someone else not achieving the life fully lived, it's like Jung couldn't hold it back anymore. And he just yells out, "You're wandering and unhappy because you're not living your animal element." Because of this outburst, Jung is taken to the insane asylum due to a religious-induced dementia. Now, Jung's tone is satirical when he's questioned by the asylum professors, agreeing that imitating Christ can get you put away, and saying that he summoned the voices he's hearing. Back in his cell, Jung realizes divine madness cannot be integrated into society, but wonders if society can be integrated into madness. Jung believes that those who do not live their animal element will treat others like animals. He says we must listen to the lament of the dead and deal with their failures. Active imagination for January 18th. Jung's soul encourages him to embrace his madness, that all life is actually illogical, and that man works hard to find reasons so that knowledge can make rules for him to follow, but that life has no rules. His mental ward neighbor confesses he is Christ, who was supposed to marry the Mother of God, but he cannot save the world because the devil will not let him, since they are in hell. This fool, as Jung calls him, explains that the asylum director, who is the devil, impregnates the Mother of God every night, and she gives birth every dawn to the son, and then the devil savagely kills the son. Jung feels alone and is instructed to remain calm, for there is no salvation. Knowing chaos is to know there is no firm foundation to stand on and nowhere to hide. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that everyone was doing good. If this seems like, oh my gosh, it's too much. If you have any questions, if something seems like I have no idea what he's talking about,
I have a comment about that. Let it
Yeah.
flow over you because it's archetypal. And if we get our intellect in and try and figure this out, that isn't the goal with Jungian stuff anyway. So keep it rolling through you and then it kind of coalesces. I do have a burning question though, because I think you said this already, but I just wanted to make sure. So the art you're showing is not from him, right?
No. And and the reason why is I remember when I saw the first couple of paintings, I didn't even know that there were that many. I thought there were just going to be a couple in there. I did not know they were his. I just knew nothing about it. And when I saw the first one, I was like, oh my gosh, this is beautiful. Who did this? And the next one, oh my gosh, this is beautiful. Who did this? And when I now see how many there are, I just want to sit there and just bask in them. So you're looking at illustrations that are nice, but I'm yapping over them, and you can look at them and go, yeah, I see here where that is that, and this is this and that, and it kind of makes sense to me. But you're not searching in it for what the story is. And I think that you should do that when you look at the Red Book and you look at the illustrations is, oh, okay, he was talking about that there is, this old man that is talking to him or whatever, and here is this old man in that situation or whatever, and meditate. Because the way that Jung worked on the Red Book, this looks like one of those things that the monks used to do. It looks like the old big Torah. It looks like these the Christian monks that would gild everything, and that was what he was going for. So it is an experience, and I don't think it's fair to go through it and be like, "Swam! Here's a tree, and this is what the tree means." Like you're saying, and I appreciate you're saying that, and that because it's absolutely true. An archetype never comes to you and says, hey, by the way, I'm an archetype, and let me tell you how I'm going to affect you. It's not how an archetype works. When you see Adam and Eve, you're not looking at a man and a woman who ate an apple, and God said, why are you eating my produce? There is something subconscious there that you have no idea what's going on. And actually, that's one of the things I had to strike from the presentation. I was going to go over about the creation because it's interesting. The creation of Eve is always, oh, she came from his rib. But if you read very carefully, God puts Adam to sleep. So he is not aware of her creation because Eve is part of him. She comes out of him. So he has no concept. Just like a mother, when the baby's born, the baby's like, oh, you were always there. Now the mother goes into another room and the baby absolutely loses it because it's like, oh my God, the infinite thing is gone. And that's what Adam and Eve had. He was part of her and she was part of him. And it's funny because their names change in the Torah. I think later on after the fall, he is addressed as, if I'm correct, I can't remember now the whole way, but I believe he is Ish and she is Ish. So it's like even their names have changed because prior to that, it was Adam, and I don't think that she's even that she doesn't even receive the name Chava yet. So it is all about how things are perceived. And it's very important that there's a part in creation where Adam names the animals. And the way that we think of it is that Adam goes around going, okay, dog, cow, blah, blah, blah. But what Adam is doing is separating these animals from him. This is a sheep, which is not me. And this is a dog, which is not me. But they are still part of me. When the fall happens, they are completely separated. And that is why they must go outside of the walled garden of paradise, because that circle, that mandala that we'll be hearing about later, is the self. And so that was the self of God. And they were cast out of the self of God. They are now man. And that's why they suffer, because they are now man. These are how archetypes work. They're not straightforward. And so I thought this was a better approach to just go through this so that you see the symbols like hard and fast. Because the first time I read the red book, I'm like, nothing is sinking in. And then when I went through it again, it's like, oh, yeah, well, Salome, I completely know throughout the whole story what she represents. I know what Elijah represents. I know Philemon later on, what they represent, and how they all intertwined with each other. But at a first glance, it just doesn't sink in. It's a lot of stories overlapping. So I thought this would be the best way, and that way you're looking at illustrations that don't really matter later on. But I will give a quick look at the paintings. So with that, let's get back to Jung in the Nut House. So Jung is in the insane asylum, and in his active imagination, he's not actually in the insane asylum. And so now on the morning of June 19th, his soul says that so on January 19th in the morning, Jung's soul says that the door should be removed to allow passage to the in-between, between all opposed things. He wakes up back in the kitchen. He's no longer in his asylum cell. He wakes back up in the kitchen with the librarian's fat cook, and he goes to return the book to the librarian. And returning to the anteroom, all of a sudden, he comes through the green curtains and finds a theater with a garden setting like another Wagner opera. We were talking about the Ring of the Uberlund before with Siegfried and what have you, and now this is Wagner's opera of Parsifal, of the Holy Grail. The librarian and the cook are now playing characters, while a couple of other actors look like Jung, and Jung is also the audience. Makes no sense. Anyway, the Jung playing Parsifal takes off his armor of history, washes his hands and feet at a spring, dresses in his regular clothes, and walks out of the play to become one with Jung. And Jung says to accept one's self, one must accept their other, the darkness, the unconscious. Come on. So, active imagination, January 22nd, Jung calls on his soul again, and she dives into the floods. And she asks if he will accept what she brings. Now, I just want to explain, because this is going to happen in a couple of times here. He's going to call upon his soul at the beginning of the active imagination, before he was actually crawling into these crevices, these caves, and going into the darkness. Now that he has kind of this rapport with his soul, he kind of like commands her to, go fetch me this. Just go down and do this for me. So he calls on the soul to go down. She asks, will you accept whatever I bring? The deteriorating armaments of battle, from the past that litter the earth, all the superstitious fetishes of dark history, all the atrocities performed by mankind against mankind, all the catastrophes that have befallen. He's like, yeah, all of that. But when she offers all the wonders achieved by mankind, Jung says that's too much wealth to grasp. She asks him not to set limits on what he can accept, to take joy and its endless growth, but to accept it with modesty, to prune his trees. Jung's soul gives him ancient things that foretold of the future: war's misery, magic's darkness, and religion as a gift. The three unravel and bring together chaos, but Jung could not grasp the horrors of what was to come. Jung prunes all that has unfolded before him, but reminds us that knowledge cannot hold back all that one is not living, and one cannot know beyond one's self. So to try is to stifle the life of those who are whole. Jung continues to prune away at the knowledge until he doesn't know himself anymore and wishes he was primitive, a true clean slate, beginning anew and free. This idea of being just clean slate, just pared down of everything, absolutely terrifies him. Uh, January 23 active imagination. Jung's soul gives him a magical rod from the darkness, shaped like a black snake with pearl eyes, and says it demands the sacrifice of one's solace. Jung finds this inhumane, but his soul is matter of fact about it, citing that nature is without solace. Jung deals with the tension of receiving the rod as his soul tells him to keep eyes and ears open. Jung feels the power of the rod and feels a despisal for men. He understands that the future is solely up to one's self as one walks only one's own path at the cost of being utterly alone. And this is another big lesson in Jung that I should reiterate. You can only walk your own path. This is one of the reasons why he broke with Freud. Freud was talking about if you have a oral fixation, then that oral fixation is exactly as someone else's, There's Oedipal complexes, there are electric complexes, and that is it. And Jung disagrees. Jung says that your path is completely unique, that they can have similar patterns, but that what you are going through and what you are using in the unconscious to access what you are going through may be similar, but is not exactly the same. And he ends with the vision of a solitary working his magic. The next act of imagination on January 27th, Jung sees a black snake winding around the cross, enter the body of the crucified, and out his mouth. The snake is now white. It wrapped around the deceased's crown, and the crown lit from above, and the sun rising is bright beyond belief. Jung is confused, but a white bird on his shoulder tells him to let everything have its unfolding. The crucified lived his life, which again, remember that animal element that Jung says must be lived. The crucified lived his life, lived it, which is why its sacrifice is so great. And to live that life was to be humble, because to truly live is an unpleasant task, because it includes the descent. Pathetic forms from Christ's own essence were cast out for others to see. One must live with one's whole self by only bringing suffering to one's self, never at the cost of another. There is nothing else to sacrifice, only one's self. One must live this life amongst others, not an outer world somewhere else. One can only find the freedom within symbolism, the soul's freedom. Once achieved, your being yoked outside of yourself cannot affect that freedom. Origin is where mind and will are at rest. All that has gone before wishes to resurface in a new time. It's not that history wants to repeat itself the same way. It wants to be experienced in a new light, in a new time, by new generations. We live with future goals, though we determine what is to come by what we know in the present. Jung comes to the conclusion that in order to not disrupt the future, one can simply avoid striving for it and be its victim. Come what may, one can just live in the present. Jung travels to a far country to find a well-known magician, and in a house in the country by a bed of tulips, Jung finds Philemon, the old magician, with Bacchus, his wife. Jung was familiar with the portrayal of this couple in Goethe's Faust, but more commonly known in mythology, the story goes that Jupiter and Mercury are denied hospitality by all in Phrygia. Its people are deemed wicked, except for one old couple who take them in and provide them with food. They are rewarded by being brought up the mountain while their village is flooded for disrespecting the gods, and the couple become priests to the gods. They ask to die at the same time when the time comes, and when it did, their bodies transformed into trees, side by side. The moral of the story is that lovers endure in times of chaos by inadvertently welcoming the gods, because to honor the gods means coming close to being one. The life of this Philemon and Bacchus consists of watering the tulips and talking about it, seemingly want for nothing. Jung belittles Philemon's title as magician due to his feebleness, a magical rod stored away in a cupboard, which ironically is what happens to the Red Book when Jung doesn't publish it. It ends up in the cupboard of his house. The white-haired and white-bearded Philemon's eyes are alive. Jung inquires about his magic, saying that the profession in this age the professors in this age know nothing about it any more than Philemon says, and that may be for the best, but that magic can be reborn in everyone and never truly lost. Philemon takes to Jung because his reason is not holding him back from exploring, but warns that to do away with reason completely is to do away with consistency. Philemon explains that magic is the negative of the knowable and cannot be understood. There is nothing to understand. As reason declines with age, it is easier to be a magician when one is old. Philemon keeps answering in riddles, and Jung leaves frustrated. The people Jung passes in the street all believe Philemon has passed his teachings on to him. Jung understands that what reason cannot comprehend is magical in nature, and this is another really important part of the Red Book. Again, reason cannot comprehend the magical in nature. Reason suspends the need for magic, and we live in the age of reason. However, much of the world around us is beyond our comprehension, so we need magic to initially explore its depths. There's nothing to understand, but by experiencing that world magically, there is a form of understanding, one which reason has yet to comprehend. When magic becomes known, it should not be rejected. But to live open to magic requires a more solitary, meditative state, at ease with uncertainty. Jung understands that Philemon loves his own soul and unites all aspects of his self. One cannot successfully love others, body or soul, until one loves their own soul completely. Jung sees Philemon as snake-like, elusive, but dangerous in his healing, one who sustains himself on his self and makes others feed on themselves. This is why he's not glorified as a healer, because his ways are instructive and thus unsavory, though effective. The way of the Savior has made men think they are entitled to gifts without service, instead of teaching mankind to take responsibility for their souls and rise to the godly status, if they wish to. Christ achieved divine oneness, but his followers think that the oneness of another will save them, when he was trying to show them a way to save themselves. Active Imagination on January 29th of 1914, Jung has learned magic from Philemon suddenly, and can now catch the snakes he sees and decorates his cave with their bodies. He sits on a red rock and lulls a snake by playing his flute into believing she is his soul. The snake speaks in trivialities, fearing that Jung is becoming too comfortable with her. Remember, he's just, telling the soul, go get me some. It's becoming too comfortable. And she tells him that the becoming of the soul's nature is serpentine, undulating in opposites. The snake strikes at Jung's heart for hesitating, but he wears chainmail. He's learned to oscillate too on both sides of the path. Active Imagination for February 1st, Jung instructs the snake to go into the depths, find what comes next after opposites become one. He feels like, I'm done, I've achieved it. From the depths emerge God, the Trinity, heaven, and Satan, who is freezing in this upper realm. Jung demands to know why after the union of opposites, all seems to have gone quiet. Satan replies that stillness is the nature of the absolute, which he abhors. The absolute does not favor living, and Satan says he is the master of life because he is restless, striving for and tearing it down. Jung realizes that the life of the absolute is the forefather of all, and that Satan is the life of the individual. Satan crawls back into the underworld, and Jung now sees that the stillness from the supposed union is the beginning of anything and everything, and the beginning will start inconspicuously, as it always does. The Caballero, primal deities of Greek mythology, gnomes from beneath the threshold of consciousness, welcome Jung as the master of the low nature. They explain that they are the ones who bring the unconscious slowly to the surface by adhering it to what grows. They watch and warn that their work cannot be rushed. Jung processes the cabaret no further until they bring to him the intricately intertwined root-like knot that binds him and give him a sword to cut through it. Jung recognizes that this is his brain, and they explain that physical birth created the intricate network of the brain, but the earth provides what is needed to separate oneself from it, to prevail over madness. Jung snaps at them since they are responsible for the brain, but they explain that severing from the brain will loosen his true nature. They form the brain, which only holds one back. They explain that severing the brain will restore the control, will destroy them, but the master must serve himself. Jung does as they ask, and then feels he is in a new world where nothing ebbs once brought forth. He serves only himself. This world rose from the beyond and was not built with the consciousness. He is accepted and united with the beyond. Active imagination for February 2nd, 1914. Jung instructs the snake to bring him something from the beyond, but it shows no interest. She descends into hell and finds an ugly hanged man with jutting ears and a hunchback. The man had poisoned his parents and wife to end their suffering and deliver them to blessed eternity, to honor God. He wanted to give his children a better future, and his wife was in ill health, which is why he thinks she would have been on board with her murder. The man and the snake confirm everything seems impersonal there. The snake tells Jung the absolute and personal life cannot reconcile because they are merely differences, not opposites. Jung understands that when he first descended into the depths at the beginning of the Red Book, the sun went out and the depths were serpent-like because he wanted to remain living in the light, in the image of God. Since then, he's taken on the serpent-like nature, uniting with the serpent, which allowed him to not fall under the devil's influence. And by resisting the devil, Jung bound him, made the devil's descendants, the cabaret, serve him, and sacrificed them with the sword. By doing so, Jung no longer lives the personal, but also satisfied the demands of the dead, and in doing so, there is an immobilization of both, an emptiness. The restlessness of the beyond has become still. Active imagination for February 9th, Jung feels he is his self and feels accomplished, but the snake points out that he is being presumptuous, that life is just now ready to be lived. The snake presents Jung with a gift. Elijah brings Salome, who can now see, for Jung to marry. Jung retorts that he is already married and that this would be incest. Salome asks why he won't love her when she would love him. Jung cannot accept Salome because they would burden one another and instead asks that she live a free and joyous life to the fullest. Elijah is upset that Jung has taken his snake to the upper world. Salome lost pleasure but gained love for the other rather than seductress. And Elijah lost the power of wisdom but recognized the spirit of the other. Active imagination for February 11, Jung calls on the snake again to determine what to do about Salome's continued supplication, but it turns into a white bird and ascends into the clouds. The bird finds a crown in heaven that appears in Jung's hands with the inscription, "Love never ends." The bird turns back into a serpent. Salome confesses she's given up on Jung, but cries because he is not as invulnerable as she thought, now that he has the magical rod. Jung is left hanging on the tree of life until he understands the meaning of his being crowned. He hangs for 3 days between earth and sky as the snake turns into a bird again and ascends heavenward. On a branch near him appears a black snake with pearly eyes. Satan appears and tells Jung to withdraw the union and Jung can return to the earth. The white bird finally returns and reveals that to love the earth, what comes under us, one hangs. The sky, what is beyond us, one hovers. The crown and the serpent are revealed to be one yet opposites, as it once crowned the crucified in another vision. Jung is told if he flies, so will Salome, and he glides to the earth. Jung regrets severing from the cabaret as now everything depends on him. Jung understands that once a life has developed, it should be freed from its mother figure, actually, which is love, because life wants to be lived. Love wants to have. Love is the beginning of everything, but life is its being. Jung blames Philemon for impregnating Jung's soul into giving birth to the Antichrist. Active Imagination, February 23, Jung's soul, the snake, tells him his still searching is holding him back. She tells him a story of a king with no son and confesses his sins to a witch in the forest, which results in his embarrassment. The witch instructs him to bury a pot of otter lard in the earth, and 9 months later, he finds a son in that spot. The child grows to be a man and demands the king's crown because he knows he was born from sorcery. The king returns to the witch and confesses no sin this time because he wants to carry a sin out to kill his son. She instructs him to bury a pot of otter lard again in the earth, and over the next months, the son weakens and dies. And the king buries the body in the ditch beside the empty pot. After some time, the king can't deal with the sadness and returns to the witch, who instructs him to do the same as before, and he was happy during the wait. When he returned to the spot 9 months later, the dead body was gone, but a newborn was found in the pot, his dead son, alive. The boy grew with great speed, and in 20 weeks, he claimed the crown as before. Only this time, the king grants it to him, and both were content. After the story, Jung is surprised that the snake implies that he should hand the reins over to his offspring in these visions, the self. Jung's soul explains that the feminine must nurture the offspring so it can live for Jung, and Jung can learn to love. Jung is ashamed to take the role of the child, and that he wanted to be a man in every way. Remember, before he wanted to be the sun when Isdbar became the sun. So he wants to be a man in every way. But the snake insists that to create, there must exist this relationship, mother and son, the snake and Jung. Jung gives the crown to the self to unite the separated for Jung, because no man that has grown up to be a man can completely bind the above and below. On April 19, 1914, Jung called upon his serpent, and his son comes out of the waters demanding his life. Again, this is active imagination, not his real son. The son he has a lion's mane, and his body is covered in snakeskin. The son says Jung should be relegated to the earth while he ascends to the light of the sun. He also announces Jung is pregnant with child, that he has the child. The son tells Jung no one else holds Jung's God but Jung, that he will never find him in those he thinks hold God. And so he will feel God is never in his presence. He will feel he is alone, but only he holds his God. The son departs and says he will return in a renewed form. Jung feels God has left him. In the scrutinies, the last part after the Liber Secundus, Jung still doesn't trust his soul in regards to the dead that come knocking every night at his door. So Philemon preaches to them. But Philemon warns Jung to respect and love his soul, but not to trust her completely. And then on July 1914, actually at the beginning and end of June and the beginning of July, Jung has the same dreams of being in a foreign land when a cold descends over everything and the world freezes. In the last of these dreams, however, he also finds himself in England feeling the need to get home fast, but he finds it frozen as well. The leaves of a tree have turned to grapes, which the cold have instilled with healing juices, which he gives to a crowd that has been waiting. Jung saw how the parallel with what was happening with the war and the grapes were the fruit of this work that would benefit the public. And that is pretty much the Red Book, primarily the Prime book and the second book. And now we're going to look at the artwork, if this works. And of course, it's going to put it over here. There we go. can we? Alrighty. So I'm trying to see if that is not seen. Now are you seeing it?
No, we're seeing. Okay.
There we go. Alrighty. So, and Hope, I thank you because I was trying to look for a place that would have all of these, and you sent that link, which I had come across this one, and I was like, oh my gosh, she found it. That is fantastic because I completely lost this one. And it was just a really great resource to look at the painting. So there's the Libra Primus. So this is the actual red book. And it's very tiny, but again, white dove. And now the calligraphy is not going to be the actual pictures. That's just some of the illumination of the lettering. But you can see here there's a small castle, and I think one of these has, I believe that is Jung, and there's the scarab with the beheaded hero and the red sun, and that is him going into the depths. And here is him, looks like he's pushing Siegfried off of that cliff with his chariot. And here he is meeting Salome and Elijah for the first time. And so that's the first book. And then, as I mentioned, it looked like the parchment paper wasn't really working out. So now, all of a sudden, in the second book, the artwork is a lot better. Oh no, and I think I lost it. Sorry about that. I need to not go back on it.
Our mouses are so sensitive.
I
Whip
know.
things around. I know.
Wait till we get the ones that you can just do with your finger hovering in the air. All right, so this is, see if I can remember. There's that castle in the middle of the lake that was mentioned. No, all of this is handwritten by Jung. This is all calligraphy. This is not, I went onto Word and found a font and typed it up. This is handwritten. So from 1913 to 1914, he was writing everything, jotting it all down in his black book notes. And then the rest of the time, all those years, he was painting and writing in this, transferring it over. And as he was going through this was when he was noticing the patterns and coming up with the ideas of, I'm noticing that this keeps popping up. I'm noticing that the snake is doing this and the colors of the snake and what they're talking about with the descent of the soul and what have you. And here are some winged spheres, and here is a scarab. And this is pretty amazing for a man that we know nothing artistically about, but apparently he could paint, and he did some sculptures too. So some red suns. And now here is where it starts to get into the larger paintings. This is Izdubar, which later on becomes Gilgamesh of the famous The Epic of Gilgamesh, which I believe is one of the oldest accounts of the flood. And there's another one coming up where we see Gilgamesh here just pretty much about to die. That is when he's been wounded by the words of science, and he needs to be carried into the West so that Jung can figure out a way to heal him. This one is an illustration of the Arthra Veda. It's a Veda of magical spells, and these were incantations that Jung was trying to say over Izdubar to try to resuscitate him. Here's the egg that Izdubar was carried in, and some incantations that he is, more incantations that he was saying, and eventually comes, where is the carpet? There. That is Izdubar being cracked open from the egg and sprouting up into the heavens, and he becomes a sun. And after this, there are some beautiful mandalas, probably because this is the area where the liver was being eaten and the woman was being tortured. So probably didn't want to illustrate that, and instead decided to go into a little bit of mandala work here, which Jung is also famous for. And again, these are, I mean, this is just like, tainted glass. It's just beautiful. And again, these are not works that I think you just look at and talk about. And I mean, there's stuff here that looks like, hieroglyphics and things. And this is meant to be sat down. And also this one kind of reminds me of a lotus. And that would be the waves of the water. I don't know what he was thinking to do that, but there's so much to sit and look through and let it sink in and find and see the pattern. I mean, what is this red dot? Is that the sun? Is this the different rays of the sun? It's like, what is it? But that's what archetypes do. They speak to the unconscious. They are familiar to the unconscious. One's unconscious recognizes another unconscious. So it's not something that you can just look at and go, well, that's aesthetically nice. And that there's just so many. And the choices of the colors are just, seriously, I think this is absolutely gorgeous. And this mandala, I think, is really interesting. It has the four entrances, kind of like a Tibetan Buddhist mandala. And the male up here, and I don't know if that's a male also, but these two figures, the north and the south, are in circles. So once again, that is yourself, the representation of yourself. But, and I'm sorry, I'm going to lose the screen here because I need to scroll down, and I got to come back to it. I'm probably going to crud. Again, love technology. Sorry about that. Because I don't want to miss this part, because I noticed it and I'm like, I want to make sure that that is correct, that the circles represent the self, but then this kind of like almond shape is not a mandala, it is a mandorla. And you'll see that a lot. You see it a lot in Hildegard von Bingen, in her artwork. Actually, you'll see it in a lot of religious artwork everywhere. It's usually Jesus and Mary that are in it. And the mandorla is where those two circles superimpose onto each other. You've got, the circle of the self up here, but the mandorla usually is about transition or transformation. It looks like the yoni in Hindu religions, the female aspect of life. It is the opening of life. It is the circle of the physical with the circle of the spiritual that have overlapped onto each other. And this is why it's usually a symbol for Christ or for the Virgin Mary, because Mary was a virgin, so she was physical, but the spiritual came through her, and Jesus was the fusion of the two. So the two of them are both perfect spheres, and they can walk in that. And if you're going to get anatomical, it is also the birth canal. That is how we come into this world. So that one I think is fantastic, and I also love the movement of these quarters and the colors around, that they don't just stay the same ones all the way around. Whoops, that one kind of looks like a medicine wheel, like a Native American medicine wheel. Oh, and also notice here that those are the 7 points of the 7 rays are within the center. So again, it's not necessarily that Jung knew what these were. These just feel right. And that is what archetypes are. They're not textbook necessarily. They are very generalized, they're very fluid, and they flow into each other and sometimes encompass each other. Here, I believe, was the ray of spirit that strikes the body. This was when he was in his madness. And I believe the snake falls dead when he goes into the depths. This is the divine child, which I think is just adorable. I don't know why he's just like sumo suit. I don't know. It's just kind of interesting. And this was, I believe it was the Hall of God. And this one was the dragon that swallowed the sun and being begged to not swallow the sun, but he does it anyway. So the sun has, the dragon, I'm sorry, must be slain, because that is what must be done in order for one to regain that divinity. And this one, I believe, is the Philosopher's Stone. Yeah, this one is the Philosopher's Stone, which he said was a kind of lapis, and that this is the shadow of the Philosopher's Stone, because everything has its shadow, especially something that is supposed to be so spiritually profound. And then here is the celestial water bearer watering the plants that the Caballero will come forth from. And this is the dead body of the dragon that ate the sun down here, used as fertilizer. So fun stuff. This was apparently a vision that Jung kept having as a child of this port town that was being flooded over. I don't think it has anything to do with that large flood that he kept having the vision of. And this one was the 4 stages, that's the triumph of love. I can't remember what the 4 stages were, but you can see the same individual. I know one was emotion and something else. And this one, I believe, was for the last day of judgment, kind of like the Norse Ragnarok. That moment where everyone is kind of responsible for their own deeds. And this one is the combining of white magic with black magic. One of these is also the snake at wrapping around the tree of life. And I think that one is the acceptance of the white knight. I'm just afraid if I do the notes, I'm gonna lose the picture, but I need to lose the notes because I gotta explain properly what that is. I don't like to leave it half baked. It's the divine child. So Okay, so that one is. I can't believe I just did that. All righty, take two. All right. So that one is the four phases of sacrifice: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. That's what that one is. And then this one is the serpent-like nature of magic. And this one, if I understood correctly, is Yggdrasil, the world tree, also from Norse mythology, which makes sense because it kind of looks like it would be. The notes in the red book are kind of confusing on this one, kind of sparse. And destruction of the world, called Muspili, which I've never heard of, the abode of the fire gods, wrapping around the tree of life, and that's this one. So the fire gods wrapping around the tree of life within the cosmic egg, which is also a symbol of Jung's that is pretty well known. And then we're gonna get down to the one that everybody loves, and that is Philemon. This is Philemon the magician, the last part of the second book of the Red Book. And Philemon is also kind of Jung's old sage soul, that brings him the serpent-like nature. And the book was put together by the Philemon Foundation, which Sonu Shamdasani is co-founder. So this is really important. I had never heard of Philemon and the myth of Baucis as before, but it has been painted a million times. So it is apparently a very important, sweet myth. And then this one is, that almost looks like a vinyl album from the 70s. I just think it's gorgeous. This is the Greek Kore statue. Kores were ideal images in Greek society that just did not have the hardship of life sculpted on their faces. They just had this kind of midway smile that was happy but not too happy. And this is a representation of the anima taking the place of the altar. And then further down, there's another mandala. I believe it is that one that was inspired by the death of a friend of Jung. And that one almost looks like, I don't know if you've ever seen cymatic sound waves. They are the patterns that are believed to template the world around us. So the Fibonacci sequences, flowers, snails, nautiluses, all of those things are believed are the sound waves that create these patterns. And that one is really just looks like that. I don't know. I think at the turn of the century was when cymatics was being explored. I just don't know if they had already pictures or drawings of that. And then this is, I thought this was just a mandala, but this apparently is a mandala of a golden castle seen from above, which also here has the ground of black and yellow tile representing opposites. And there's this last one, which I find really interesting. The colors in that starburst remind me of the artwork depicting Buddhist rainbow bodies. It just looks the same. So I'm now going to close this one and go back to my screen that hopefully will take me back to normal. And let me just confirm that by looking on my phone here. And it's not. So why is it not? Okay, there we go. So we're seeing that. And all right, so again, those are best experienced by meditating on them page by page with no rush or distraction. And it's really crazy for a book that had been hidden away for so long. It is so easy to find pictures of these. They're everywhere. They are, I mean, it's funny because I would expect to maybe see one or a small portion of one. There are web pages with just like all of them. And so they're very accessible. And I would recommend buying the actual book because I mean it is just something that would be nice to have on your coffee table to show everybody. But anyway, so did that switch to? Yes. All right. So we're back to active imagination. So done with the visions? Yeah.
And we're at 9:10. So
yes.
Most people, we finished, I mean, I think our schedule is to finish at 9. So this is fascinating, and whoever wants to stay, they will, and then we can maybe have a short discussion too.
Sure.
Mind-blowing. Thank you.
No problem. And I will try to zip through these as quickly as possible. So active imagination, what Jung was doing in these visions. Sonu Samdashani says that Jung came up with the process of active imagination by visualizing himself digging a hole into the depths of himself when he was trying to look inside. And apparently by imagining the activity and interacting with the unconscious, he found the unconscious reacted and it responded. And rather than distract from its response, Jung just allowed it to unfold. Now, the important thing to note is that does not mean to imagine a series of events. One presents the issue, one wishes to deal with the unconscious and awaits a response. You're not creating from nothing, you are observing what is present with the imagination. One responds as if the dialogue is real and pertinent. This is what makes it active, your participation. If your normal response would be an action, you visualize interacting with the intention to follow through. What I mean by that can be seen in Jung's carrying out of carrying Izdubar to the house to be healed. He didn't imagine the giant being easily movable. To daydream would be to imagine them both flying through the air and just reaching, the west, and we're done. In fact, everyday imagination, Izdubar need not have been poisoned by Jung's words at all. Jung could have just said, do-over. But Jung dealt with the giant's situation as if the conflict and its consequences were real, and the solution had to be processed in a manner that made some kind of sense, even if it was nonsense. And this is what shamans mean by using intention. All the rhyming and cool-looking accessories won't accomplish a thing without intention. So Jung makes Izdubar lighter through some rationale and then shrinks him down to an egg. Only when another problem presents itself, the size of the door, Izdubar must go through. The choice of the egg subconsciously comes from the chain of events and coincides the soon-to-be rebirth of a god. It feeds itself. So it's not like dreaming because it's kind of like lucid dreaming, but again, you are stepping into the unconscious, so you have a little bit more control. The messages are deeply personal. Again, it won't mean the same for someone else that it means for you. And I've also seen descriptions of active imagination as restraining the consciousness and watching for signs while relaxing and observing. And Jung's experience in the Red Book is peppered throughout with his not allowing the very messages he wants to come because he's searching too hard or wanting them too eagerly. So the tightrope to walk on with active imagination is to just kind of suspend the consciousness and let it kind of drift, let it happen. You go into it and let the messages talk to you. So one should start by preparing a safe personal space where you won't be disturbed. Jung suggests picking some image from a fantasy if one does not present itself automatically, and simply observe it. If a particular mood strikes, you observe what image emerges from the mood. Either way, the next thing to do is simply observe and let whatever unfolds unfold. He called the true archetype nature psychoid and believed it couldn't be brought into the light of the conscious, but the archetype itself could come into the consciousness as a composite of images from the conscious self. Though how the archetype unfolds and what it relays still stems from the unconscious. And all of that is fueled by the libido, which tends to ebb and flow. So Jung conducted these experiments over a period of a month, and when they seemed to have tapered off at that time, he didn't really push it. Also, like dreaming, active imagination can produce more intense visions the first few times after a long interval or after something profound occurs in one's life. And like dreaming, if you deny the unconscious, its voice will surface with surprising intensity. So the truth is, active imagination is not something new. Jung simply figured out how its nature and how the pattern. Is this not going to the next one? Oh, there we go. All right. So he simply figured out the nature, and with his interest in otherworldly beliefs, outer world beliefs, he started noticing that there were patterns throughout the world of how people went about doing this, which is probably from our collective unconscious. So ways that people actively imagine. What are they? There's tarot cards. All of those figures that you see on tarot cards are basically archetypes. The fool is the young, innocent person at the beginning of life or the beginning of their journey who knows nothing, is afraid of nothing, is looking up at the sky, is about to walk off of a cliff, doesn't know the dangers. And he is in just an absolute clean slate state. And then as you go through life, you undulate in that serpent-like energy into the magician, male, high priestess, female, empress, female, emperor, male, and so on and so on, and to something a little more strict, and to something a little more freer, and back and forth and back and forth. These are all phases of life that we are familiar with. And the major arcana has some 20-some cards to it, and the suit cards are swords, cups, coins, and clubs, and these are all images that you can relate to as archetype. Now, the conscious mind knows what those images mean, but depending on how they are cast and relate to one another in relation to a question, their meaning will change, just like archetypes, even to the point that the reader's gut may completely go against the usual significance of the card or the cards. Crystal gazing. And here's a hint. Find a ball made of crystal with imperfections. Everyone always thinks, oh, but I want to get the one that's like crystal clear and I can see right through it and everything is upside down. Kind of defeats the purpose of what you're trying to do. When you have imperfections on the inside of a crystal ball, especially cloudiness, that's what the eye tries to focus on and can't. If you're looking at a crystal ball where you can see everything upside down, that's no different than just looking at the world around you. It may work, but if you really want to work with a crystal ball, you need to look at something that's going to keep the eye busy so that the unconscious can surface. Aboriginal walkabouts and dream time, embodying shaman spirits through masks, sometimes known as shapeshifting or skinwalking. Magic realism is also common in these and other cultures worldwide. My family is Cuban, and I grew up around a lot of people that dealt with magic realism. We believed that if a bird pooped on your shoulder, that it was some kind of omen, or if the wind hit your left shoulder blade, that you could be paralyzed. I mean, it was just, everything was not black and white. There was a lot of stuff that you were like, well, why does that happen? And the answer was just always, it does. Sweat lodges, or as the Lakota call it, inipi, which means to live again. Whirling dervishes, dance therapy, or expressive art therapy. Dance movement therapy is another way to approach active imagination. It's the type of therapy was created by Jung and Tony Wolff, the Swiss analyst, around 1916. DMT uses movement and dance instead of visualization to manifest the unconscious, allowing the patients to express themselves through their body when they're ready to do so, while the analyst witnesses the outcome, just objectively. Jung described this as patients who danced their mandalas. Dancers who undergo this type of therapy regularly describe a point where the dancer is no longer moving, but is being moved. In other words, by expressing the inner impulses, the ego has taken a back seat to the self. Sometimes during this dance, visual imagery is experienced and encouraged and to be interacted with. For many, this type of therapy is especially liberating, as they have experienced a disconnect with their body, a history of being too self-conscious, or feel the body as superficial and non-expressive. The lady on the left is the famous Martha Graham, and as you can see, she's not dancing like normal people do. It's not just, left, right. It was the emotion. You need to see my emotion. My heart is, and not heart this way normal, an uncomfortable position for the heart to release itself. And the pain and anguish of holding a loved one that is kind of like in the pietà kind of position, those are not our normal ways of moving. And as Jung pointed out in the Red Book, magic is approaching the unconscious in a mysterious way. If you do the same routine over and over and over and over, then your body just says, well, this is normal. But if you do it in a different way, everything about you questions things. Why are you doing it this way? And why does this feel differently? And do I like what I'm doing? Maybe I don't like that. Maybe I do like it. Maybe I should do that more. Maybe I should be on a sand hill running around with umbrellas acting like a crazy person. Hey, you know what? One of the best things is that when you find that release through that kind of movement, you'll laugh. You'll laugh, you'll feel great, you'll feel stupid, but you feel good for feeling stupid. And we are so afraid to have that mask judged, but that mask is not us. There are dances done, that same type of dances, expressive, done by Kachina dancers and santeros. They're just wild. You go with the music. With the santeros, the term is se te monta el santo, which is the spirit mounts you. It takes you over, and that person will act like the spirit. Walking a labyrinth, creating a mandala. A labyrinth is a mandala. And this is Jung's famous contribution to the art world, because in nature, the most efficient shape is the perimeter. And we see ourselves as 360 degrees of consciousness. So we are always observing the world around us in this kind of sphere. And so when you draw this, something unconsciously knows that you're dealing with some expression of yourself, or something that you need to take into yourself. Rorschach ink blots. We all know these, and we think that they're funny, and it's like, but this is the unconscious looking at the conscious world and saying, but I see something that's not supposed to be there. And you should know why. What is your body holding that makes you see something differently? The unconscious knows, and the unconscious will tell you. Web diagrams used for streams of consciousness. Sometimes you'll, go off on some of these branches and come up with things you're like, whoa, what made me think of that? Conscious dying. which, funny enough, you all are talking about. And it sounds stupid, but let me tell you something. I underwent a conscious dying workshop, and it was the most emotionally gut-wrenching thing. Someone read my eulogy. They went through the whole process of covering me in a shroud. And it was not more morbid. It was freeing. It was liberating. And what is great is that you see the process of, well, if I wasn't responsible anymore for the world around me, I mean, let's take this, let's really live this out. I'm done. I'm gone. The physical me is gone. And what a relief. It is life changing. So I definitely want to see that class. Family constellations. This is not Adler. Hope. I'm sorry. His constellations were a little bit different, and I've actually done these. Family constellations are interesting. You come with your issue or your trauma, and these group of people will come there, and you pick people from those that want to be there. And I want you to be my father, and you're going to be my neighbor because the issue was with my neighbor when I was a child and what have you. And it's really weird, but these people will start to move and act like the situation that caused your trauma without you telling them anything about it. And sometimes even these people will have the same traumas and will release them. It is crazy. I would not have believed it if I would not have gone to these. In fact, there was one where this woman went and her father was a dentist. And there was all these things that were behind it about how he wanted to have a better business, blah, 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 blah. And that there was a lot of holding back and there's a lot of sadness and grief because of that. And the man that she had chosen to be her father was kind of smirking, and the person that was guiding all of this, he's like, and why are you chuckling? He's like, because I'm a dentist and I want to start my own practice. And my wife and I keep arguing about this. And she's over on the floor and she's going, oh, no, 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 no. And he's like, this is crazy. And I feel like we need to have a talk because I now realize that I'm holding myself back. So this is, again, another part of active imagining, that you can't explain how the collective unconscious does this. Mirror therapy for phantom limb pain. Yes, you are shooting off certain nerves in the brain that are no longer shooting off, and that could be a part of it. But also, you don't get to grieve a limb when it's suddenly taken away from you. And to see it in a mirror can kind of allow you to make peace with that. And it emotionally helps people heal as well, which is an issue that we have. Not healing emotionally. Role playing, we all know this. Now, what's really funny is that, sure, role playing starts off as fun, but then there are people that go into role playing and find that after an hour of being in these costumes, they kind of take on the full personality of the person that's there and say, I would totally know what this person would have done in this situation. And I stuck Spider-Man in there, not just because I'm a big Spider-Man fan, but Spider-Man is so beloved because he wears a mask. You can be anybody and relate to Spider-Man because you can see yourself in there without ever seeing if he's got black hair, red hair, blonde hair, if it's a man or a woman. I mean, you just really don't know. And again, live that life. Sand play therapy. And in case you're thinking you're too old for sand play, there is adult sand play. I mean, there is a kachina and there's an African fertility gods. And basically with this, with sand therapy, you are creating your own arena to deal with your issues in them. And you emotionally designate these figures and then allow the issue to play out. And because it's a safe space, the unconscious feels like it can just be completely honest. And because it's play and you're not rushing off to anybody or clocking in or anything like that. The conscious mind just says, well, it's play. I don't have to do anything. And so the conscious can be allowed to come through. So that was Dora Maria Kalf who came up with that, and she started that. I believe, what was the lady that she studied under? Can't remember. I thought I had it. Yeah, she studied under the World technique with oh, what was this woman's name? Anyway, I can't find. And basically, this is a complete fluke. Jung's daughter had her children stay over at Kalf's house, and she was so good at taking care of the children. And she's like, what do you do? They love going over there. And she's like, well, I've got a sandbox, and I let them play with it. And I let them be, and I let them do this. And she had studied under Margaret Lowenfeld. That's it, the British child psychologist who did the World technique, and using miniatures, and just the way that she encouraged children to not think that anything that they did was silly. And it's like, oh, well, the little man did this, and to tell a child, it's like, well, he can't do that. You're cutting off the unconscious, because the unconscious wants to play the way that it wants to. And if you watch that child, you can observe what the child needs. And that was what Kalf did when she would take care of these children. She would observe the unconscious unfolding in their way of playing, and then treat them accordingly. And so we're just going to leave it at that, because there's still like about 60 more of stuff with Jung, and of his beliefs, theologies, and ideas, concepts, all of these things, which just, I knew it was like way too much to cram in there, but at least we got the red book done. So open it up to any questions you may have.
You can just unmute yourself and then go ahead.
That's a good response.
Did you have a question?
that sigh is a good response to approaching the red book.
That is so much information, of course.
It is a lot of information, yes.
I just wanted to say to Michelle, there was a Michelle case she just had to leave. I know she gets up early in the morning, and she wanted to thank you for doing the presentation. She really enjoyed it. I'm glad you explained a little bit more about active imagination, because I'm just wondering how much that is like quite often going into meditation, or like in shaman work when you go into the tunnel, you go into the cave or the hole in the ground, and you let you follow it, you don't direct it, you just yeah.
And I'm glad you pointed that out, because there was something that I just glossed through real quick about what active imagination was. And one thing I really didn't want to leave out is that active imagination is not meditation. And I've seen that also listed, is like, oh, it's a meditation, or you go in like a meditation. It's like, no. Because when you meditate, you are you're wanting to quiet down the consciousness as much as possible to go into this just this minimalistic state. And it's more to go into a certain brainwave, resonance, those kind of things. That's not what active imagination is. It is, like you're saying, going into the cave, the sweat lodge. It's if you notice, a lot of these visions, Jung goes down into a cave, a crater. There is a mountain. There's always this sense of craggy, rocky, old earth going within, going into the darkness. And here's one of the things that I didn't have in the presentation at all, which when I was researching, and Sonu Samdashani at the Library of Congress was talking about the harrowing of hell when Jesus goes into the underworld. And he mentioned some things, and something popped up into my head. And it's like, okay, wait a minute. So Jesus goes through this whole ordeal, this very stressful ordeal, and he's looking into unifying himself, and is crucified and placed into a dark cave. So was that an active imagination? And, you know, with all the what ifs, what if he wasn't really completely dead when they took him down? And what happened is they take him into a cave, and this is, again, just speculation. They take him into the cave, and he understands, I am whole. I am both the high ascent and I am the descent. I am hell and I am God. And I am everything. I am one. And all the things that he was talking about. And so was that what the resurrection was? Was he hanging on the tree of life for 3 days, like Jung claims? And when he is reborn, is everything a new world, a world where he now can change everything? Because when we go into ourselves, we go in clumsily, and we're still hesitant, because it's scary and it's a lot, and we don't deal with magic realism like what I had mentioned. I'll tell you what happened when I tried active imagination. This was at the beginning of the year, and I was dealing with low self-esteem, and going to a therapist and trying to, like, let's dig deeper. Come on, let's go darker. And trying everything and start doing some active imagination. And I see myself in this like a sewer with this like brick archway, and I see myself as this rat, which of course is ill. I don't want to be associated with a rat. But that's your shadow. Now, here's the thing. The rat is a survivor. A rat lives in the darkness. He is efficient. He can find any way to find food and escape and survive. And it's like, okay, those are the good parts of the shadow. Now, the rat, I noticed, was not just a rat. He was a gold rat. And I couldn't accept that. And the gold rat then kind of folded into himself and became diamond-like, like just rainbows, just beautiful. And then he would unfold back again and become this gold rat again. And I find out months later that those are symbols, the gold and the diamond, that these are archetypes for the treasures hidden within the shadow. And I'm like, okay, makes sense. So much like Jung, there's the dirty water going through the tunnel. And I'm like, well, I need to go into the tunnel because that's where it is and there's nowhere else to go. And go into the tunnel, and I go up, and there is some light coming through, and it is the moon. And when I go outside, I just beg to the moon, just please tell me, show me. And I saw that everything was beautiful, even though everything was foggy and hazy, and there was a forest around me that just looked dead. And I was happy to not be back in that tunnel. But at the same time, I didn't know where else to go. But I felt like I had just made a huge leap there to finally come to the surface. And it's like, okay, and I will be ready for the next step when I'm ready for the next step. And that was it. Now, here's the weird part where synchronicity comes in. 2 days later, I call my mom in Florida, and we're talking, and my mom goes, by the way, did I tell you about the rat? I'm like, what rat? And she goes, there's a rat. It's just like in the house. We've lived here for 40 something years and never had a rat in here. And all of a sudden, this rat just runs across the living room. I'm like, what? And it's not even like registering, because it's like, there's never been a rat in that house. And I called her back a couple of days later, and no mention of the rat. It's like nothing has happened. I'm like, but there was a rat. She goes, oh, yeah, there is. But I mean, we're not very concerned with it. My mother would freak at any insect or bug in that house, but for some reason, this was not an issue. And this is one of those things in Jungian synchronicity that there's just no explanation for. It's, is it I picked up something that was going to happen, or is it that it resonated with both of us, that she projected, but my sister saw it too? So it's like there's all these things, but that's not the point. The whole point is that something in the collective unconscious brought this to our attentions because it was that profound. And things like that tend to happen with active imagination. It is that magic that Jung talks about, because it is the mystery of the unconscious that doesn't seem to make sense, and yet somehow affects our conscious world. So it is something that is not relaxing like a meditation. It is something that is not pleasant going into it, because you are dealing with things that are uncomfortable. You are dealing with the shadow. You're going into the unconscious. This is the unknown stuff. And so it is not a meditation, but when you cross that boundary of the fear, I mean, obviously you're not going to do something that's going to put you at risk. But if you find a cave and the cave seems safe and you want to go into the cave and just sit there and just be one with the cave, do it. If you are walking through the forest and all of a sudden feel like, just belting it out like some kind of animal, not to be rude or not to be silly or what have you, but because something in you tells you, I need to do that. I want to do that. We should follow that. We're so afraid to listen to the instinct. We're so afraid to hear that voice that tells us, no, don't go down that way. Or the voice that tells us, why don't you go this way? And usually when we hear those voices, follow those voices, we either spare ourselves something that could be like, very traumatic or bad, or we can find something that could be very pleasant. But we are in this, why am I listening to this voice? Dialogue in our head all of the time. Instead of listening to that voice, why not? There was one TED Talk that I saw that I thought was really interesting. There was this guy that wanted to be more productive with his artwork, but he didn't want to do the same things that he was doing. So he created personas. He created like 20-something different artiste personas. And he's like, this is Janelle. Janelle is from Jamaica, and she likes pottery. She mainly paints with these like really bright colors and whatever. And he had a whole backstory for Janelle. He was Janelle. And when you looked through the slides, every piece of artwork was amazing and completely different, because he created a persona for them. The same thing happens in improv. It's really crazy. When you go into improv, there are people that they'll tell them, it's like, okay, so just say the first thing that comes into your mind, and they have to think about what they're going to think about. Or do the first motion that your body wants to do, and they have to think about what that first motion should be. Instead of just doing it, just start, what you doing? It's like, I have no idea. It's like, looks like you're, whipping up peanut butter. It's like, actually, I'm just making cotton candy. It stop getting into those boxes. But the weird thing is that one of the things in improv that you do is that you name your character when you finally decide, okay, I'm going to play this. And when you name that character, if you ask that person, if they're free and they're comfortable with improv, if you ask that person anything about that character, they can tell you the whole history. They can tell you how many people are in their family, what their favorite food is, what they wore yesterday, their favorite car, because something has already created a backstory, that persona. We're so good at creating personas. It's so easy. It's so fast. But what creates the nuances of those personas are the archetypes. If that person is heroic, if that person is overly loving, if that person is a bit of a slut, and those are more like the archetypes that seep into that persona, and once they're latched in, then you confirm it with the consciousness. But there is so much that you could wake up every morning and do something completely different, but